everybody, my name is Callie C. and I am the author of The Hunt for the Hollower. I'm going to read to you from this today. We'll start at the beginning and then we'll skip a little bit later. A word from our narrator. Once upon a time, in a faraway land, there was a wizard named Merlin. This name might sound familiar, but this Merlin is not your Merlin, just as this world is not your world. This story takes place in a magical land, full of fairies and underwater cities and a lamentable absence of funnel cake. Though this story takes place in this magical land, it doesn't belong to it. Stories, you see, aren't confined to a single space or time as most things are. Now then, this story isn't about Merlin, but it begins with him. Merlin, the trusted royal advisor. Merlin, the greatest wizard in history. Merlin, who popped out of a magical portal after defeating the villainous sorceress Morgan Le Fay, and was met by a throng of anxious citizens desperate to know if evil had been vanquished.
Of course she's been vanquished,
Merlin snapped, his staff still smoking from the battle. Once this was tidied up, he'd have to report to the queen, who'd been cursed into a sheep by Morgan.
3 cheers for the most powerful wizard of all time.
Ha! Merlin scoffed. He waved his hand over the smoking end of his staff, and it burst into flames. He shook it irritably to put it out.
Wait until you see my great-great-great-great-great-grandchild.
In the back of the crowd, a boy with a falcon perched on his shoulder scowled. The portal Merlin had appeared from was already gone. The wizard stood alone, except for the crowd, in the midst of a circle of enormous stone pillars, each of them easily 5 times the height of a grown man.
Why? A centaur shouted. What will they do? An old man called out.
Merlin slammed his staff into the ground. A jet of water shot up from it, finally extinguishing the smoldering bits with a hiss.
You'll have to wait and find out. It's dangerous to know the future.
Merlin's owl familiar swooped down and perched on his staff. Don't be rude, the owl scolded. No one likes being left in the dark, especially a crowd of people who had nearly been destroyed by the embodiment of evil, but Merlin had an advantage when it came to knowing things. He had the gift of foresight. He was able to look ahead and see things that hadn't happened yet, but probably would. The future wasn't always clear, but it was exceptionally less foggy when he checked in on it than when you or I try. In any case, it was too late. Word had already swept through the crowd that Merlin's 7th descendant would do great things, wonderful things, miraculous things. This story is about Merlin's 7th descendants. Let's meet them, shall we? They're about to dabble in mischief that's going to take a turn for the worse. And now we're going to skip ahead a little bit, and what you need to know is that the 7th descendants that were just mentioned are Merlinda and Percy, and they're twins. And Percy is really, really good at magic, and Merlinda is really, really terrible at magic. So everybody assumes that Percy is who Merlin was talking about when he said, just wait and see what my great-grandchild does. And you also need to know, when a magical being's magic comes of age, they receive their familiar through a portal. And Merlinda's familiar has just arrived, but Percy's has not. Merlinda already felt a deep attachment to her familiar, though her head swirled. The septimum genus? A familiar? She took a few deep breaths, and the panic faded. She still had Percy. They would figure this out together. Percy stood up and shrugged. I suppose it's a relief. My foresight already showed me my familiar will be more impressive than a worm when it comes. This was not strictly true, as all he'd been able to see was that his familiar would indeed come one day, but it helped conceal his disappointment. Merlinda's familiar reared up like a snake about to strike.
I am a great dragon, probably. I've only been in corporeal form for a few minutes, so I'm not sure yet.
He took a deep breath and glared fiercely. The twins watched with interest, and Merlinda felt a teeny glimmer of hope. Perhaps her familiar was more than he seemed. The not-a-worm held his breath a moment longer, then let it all out in a whoosh, a tiny whoosh, and then a sneeze.
Excuse me, he said, then twisted his head around to get a good look at himself. Ah, I see.
He untwisted to face the twins again.
What did you expect? I'm clearly a very fierce wyvern. It's rare for wyverns to breathe fire before their wings grow in. Everyone knows that.
Percy stared, but it wasn't because of the familiar's pluck. It was because a familiar had come at all, and what's more, it was Merlinda's, not his. Confusion swirled through him, threatening to blow him over. A hint of something darker chased it, trying to take root and grow. He loved Merlinda, but he couldn't deny his bafflement and, he hated to admit, his envy. How was this possible? She couldn't even manage basic spells. And wasn't he the one who always fixed things when she bungled her magic? He was the most powerful wizard born in generations. The envy growled inside him, trying to find purchase, but it was rocked by another shaky thought. If he wasn't the Septimum Genus, then who was he? Percy? The shaken Merlinda's voice brought him back to the moment. She was terrified. He shoved the confusion and envy into a corner. They resisted, snarling inside him, but his sister needed him. He could sort his feelings out later. Let's have a go with them. Percy tried to sound enthusiastic, but even to him it sounded forced. Familiars help your magic, right? Maybe now you'll be able to control yours. Merlinda lifted her familiar up to eye level. What do you say? The Nottaworm craned his head this way and that to admire himself. He didn't know how he'd ever mistaken himself for a dragon. Wyverns were far superior, in his opinion. After breakfast, perhaps? Just one spell? The familiar hunched slightly. Fine, but remember I'm new at this. Try the fountain one, Percy encouraged, ignoring the dark, snarling things inside him. That should be easy. Summoning water from nowhere was supposed to be simple, but Merlinda had flooded Father's study the last time she tried. She looked to her familiar, who was curled back around her wrist. Ready? I suppose, he sighed. Percy stood next to her while Merlinda focused on the middle of the small crater. That would be a good entry point. She could sense her familiar's magic and tried to combine hers with it, to move through the elements, to the ether. Another portal ripped through the air before the twins. Unlike the first one, it was jagged and misshapen and led to nothing. The nothingness greedily sucked them toward it like a ferocious gust of wind. Merlinda yelped as her hair and robes were whipped this way and that. She reached behind her as she slipped, grasping a low tree branch. Her familiar clung to her wrist, eyes squeezed shut. Merlinda! She twisted so she could see the portal. Percy was scrabbling at the ground as he was dragged relentlessly toward the void. His eyes were wide with panic. He tried to magic ropes to shoot himself forward, but everything was sucked into the emptiness behind him. He grabbed onto a root sticking out of the ground, feet whipping behind him toward this new, darker portal. Merlinda reached for him, straining, screaming. Of all the times to be awful at magic, he wasn't that far. But the portal gave a final enormous heave, and the root Percy clung to broke. He cried out as he flew back, and the moment he disappeared inside, the portal vanished. Everything stilled. Merlinda sat up and stared, breathing hard. Percy! She screamed. She ran to the empty space where the portal had been. Percy! What had she done? How? Right in front of her, a third portal split the air, much smaller than the others. Merlinda caught a glimpse of Percy's terrified face. Percy! Merlinda shrieked. She dove at the portal. Before she could reach her brother, it winked out like the others, leaving only a crumpled piece of parchment that fell to the ground. Her fingers grasped air. Percy! Merlinda screamed again. None of this made sense. 3 portals had ripped open before her in the span of minutes, each of them different. Trembling, Merlinda reached for the parchment Percy had shoved through the portal. On it was a rough illustration of several stone pillars standing next to one another in a crude circle. Other stones were scattered on the ground, and occasionally 2 pillars had a third stacked across them, as if creating a doorway. Suns arced up over the pillars from the left and moons from the right until they met in the middle. At the bottom of the parchment, in swirled, looping letters, were 2 words: the Hollower. Thank you for reading along with me today, and if you would like more videos like this, make sure that you subscribe to the Simon Kids YouTube channel. Have a great day!